Her father gave her to the giant Apache because she was fat, but what happened next no one in town could have imagined. On a snowy street, a cruel bargain is struck. A daughter is cast away like cattle, mocked, shamed, and handed over to a towering Apache warrior. But instead of scorn, he bows low and offers her his own horse. Whispers ripple, the church bell tolls, and a secret begins to rise because this man is no savage. He carries a treaty, a faith, and a past the railroad would kill to bury. As cabins burn, as jail keys rattle, as gunsmoke thickens in the cold air, the girl everyone laughed at may hold the only voice strong enough to save him and save the land itself. But can love born of shame stand against a father's betrayal and the railroad's greed? Or will her courage be crushed before the truth is heard? Your reactions reaffirm something simple yet powerful, that stories still shape us, even in silence. If you believe in the soft endurance of love, truth, and doing what's right, then you're exactly why these stories exist. The winter wind whistled down the dusty main street of Silver Creek, carrying snowflakes that settled like scattered sugar across the hard-packed earth. Helen Barrett's boots scraped against the ground as her father dragged her forward, his fingers digging into her arm like iron bands. Ka! Her cheeks burned with shame as his angry words cut deeper than the cold. Ain't nothing but a burden, Samuel. Barrett spat, yanking her toward the center of town. Eating us out of house and home. About time I got some worth out of you. Helen kept her eyes fixed on her feet, watching the hem of her worn cotton dress sweep through the dusting of snow. The whispers started as townsfolk emerged from the general store and post office, drawn by her father's loud voice. She could feel their stares pressing against her like physical weight. Look here, Samuel called out, his voice carrying across the street. 2 fine ponies for 1 useless daughter. More than fair trade, I reckon. Laughter erupted from the saloon porch where several cowboys lounged against the railing. Helen's throat tightened as tears threatened to spill. She'd known this day was coming. Her father had been threatening it for weeks, but the reality was worse than any nightmare. Through her downcast lashes, she caught sight of a pair of well-worn moccasins at the edge of her vision. Looking up, slightly, she saw the bottom edge of a wool blanket wrapped around tall, broad shoulders. Isaac, the Apache scout, stood as still as a mountain, his presence drawing all eyes despite his silence. Samuel thrust the leather reins into his free hand, practically dancing with glee at his profitable trade. Take her then. She's your problem now. He shoved Helen forward so hard she stumbled, catching herself just before falling face first into the snow-dusted dirt. More snickers drifted from the saloon porch. Careful there, Isaac. Might break your horses' backs with that one. Helen's face burned hotter as shame coursed through her. This was how it would be, traded away like cattle, worth less than 2 ponies, destined to be nothing but the butt of cruel jokes. She waited for Isaac to grab her arm as her father had, to treat her like the burden everyone said she was. Instead, the soft crunch of snow announced his approach. Helen dared to lift her gaze as Isaac's shadow fell across her. The Apache scout moved with fluid grace, his face calm and dignified beneath the wide brim of his hat. Without a word, he handed the pony's reins back to Samuel Barrett, who stared in confusion. Then Isaac turned to his own horse, a magnificent bay stallion that had carried him faithfully through countless scouting missions. With deliberate care, he unwrapped his blanket and draped it across the horse's back like a fine lady's cape. He adjusted the stirrups, checking each carefully, before turning to Helen and executing a bow that would have honored a queen. "My lady," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the street. "Would you do me the honor of riding while I walk beside you?" Helen's heart stuttered in her chest. No one had ever spoken to her with such respect, such gentle courtesy. Her father's mouth hung open in shock as Isaac extended his hand to help her mount. With trembling fingers, Helen accepted his assistance. Isaac's strong hand steadied her as she settled into the saddle, arranging her skirts with as much dignity as any fine lady. The horse stood perfectly still, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Isaac kept only his walking staff, a beautifully carved piece of wood that had been a gift from his grandmother. He positioned himself beside Helen's stirrup like a royal guard, ready to escort her to safety. The silence in the street was absolute. Even the cowboys on the saloon porch had stopped laughing, their faces slack with disbelief. Samuel Barrett's face had turned an ugly shade of purple, but he seemed unable to form words. Helen sat straighter in the saddle, feeling the warmth of the blanket beneath her and the solid presence of Isaac beside her. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of shame begin to lift from her shoulders. In that moment, she wasn't the burden her father had always claimed she was. She wasn't the object of the town's cruel humor. Instead, she was a lady being treated with honor by a man who saw her true worth. The wind caught her hair, lifting it gently as she raised her chin. Tears pricked at her eyes again, but this time they weren't born of shame. They came from a deep well of gratitude for this unexpected gift of dignity. Isaac's quiet strength radiated upward from where he stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. Morning sun caught the silver threads in his black hair, and his dark eyes held nothing but respect when they met hers. "Shall we go?" he asked softly, and Helen nodded, unable to trust her voice, as Isaac began to lead. The horse forward, his steps measured and unhurried. The crowd parted before them like water. No one dared break the spell of the moment with a jest or cruel word. Even Samuel Barrett stood frozen, still clutching the reins of the two ponies he'd thought to trade for his daughter's freedom. The soft thud of hoofbeats and the tap of Isaac's staff against the earth marked their progress down the street. Helen sat tall in the saddle, feeling the eyes of the townspeople follow their passage. But for the first time in her life, those stares didn't wound her. Instead, she felt wrapped in the warmth of Isaac's respect, protected by his quiet dignity. In one simple gesture, he had transformed her from an object of ridicule into a lady worthy of honor. The truth of who she was, who she had always been beneath the weight of her father's cruelty, began to unfurl in her heart like a flower reaching for the sun. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mission church's weathered boards. As Isaac led Helen along the narrow dirt path, the small building stood apart from town, its white-painted cross gleaming against darkening skies. Lamplight already glowed in the windows, promising warmth within. Helen's legs trembled from the day's ride. Though Isaac's horse had carried her gently, she wasn't used to being in the saddle for so long. Isaac noticed her unsteady steps and offered his arm without comment, strength helping her up the wooden steps. At Isaac's knock, Reverend Harlan opened the door. His gray eyes moved between them carefully, taking in Helen's travel-worn appearance and Isaac's dignified stance. Though caution lined his weathered face, respect showed in the way he stepped back and gestured them inside. "Welcome to God's house," the Reverend said quietly. "Please, come warm yourselves." The mission's main room was sparse but tidy, with a pot-bellied stove radiating heat in one corner. Simple wooden benches lined the walls, and a few worn quilts were folded nearby. The Reverend had clearly been preparing his evening meal. The smell of cooking beans filled the air, and a loaf of fresh bread sat cooling on the table. "Miss Barrett can rest here tonight," Isaac said, his deep voice gentle. "Tomorrow we will continue north, but she needs shelter from the cold." Reverend Harlan nodded slowly. "Of course. Please, sit by the fire. I'll add more beans to the pot." Ellen sank gratefully onto a bench near the stove, letting its warmth seep into her chilled bones. Isaac settled on another bench, his presence solid and reassuring. The Reverend busied himself with the cooking pot, adding more beans and stirring thoughtfully. As the evening deepened outside, conversation began to flow. Isaac spoke quietly of his past, his words measured and honest. "I was young when I first served as scout for the army," he said, his dark eyes reflecting firelight. "I thought I could help build understanding between two peoples, and I saw things that broke my heart. Innocent blood spilled, promises broken like dry twigs. Helen watched the Reverend's face as Isaac spoke. The older man's expression showed growing respect as Isaac described leaving his army position to seek a better path. "Now I work for peace," Isaac continued. "My people need land where they can live with dignity, where children can grow strong without fear." He touched the cross that hung from a leather cord around his neck. "I found faith in the Creator's better way." "You speak with wisdom," Reverend Harlan said softly. "Too few seek peace these days." When the beans were ready, Isaac rose to serve the meal. Helen's breath caught as he filled her tin plate first, offering it with the same courtesy he'd shown. All day, no man had ever served her before. She'd always been expected to wait until others had eaten. The simple act brought tears to her eyes. The supper was plain, but filling beans seasoned with salt pork. Thick slices of bread still warm from baking. Helen ate carefully, trying not to show how hungry she was. Neither man rushed their meal or made her feel watched. After they'd finished, Helen insisted on helping clean up. As she stood at the wash basin scrubbing tin plates, voices drifted through the crack under the door. Her hands stilled as she recognized Mrs. Peterson and Miss Tate, two of the town's most notorious gossips. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Peterson's voice dripped with spite. "Samuel Barrett's fat one, riding off with that Apache scout. She won't last a week." Miss Tate replied with a harsh laugh. "Too soft, too heavy. He'll send her running back soon enough." Helen's chest tightened as tears threatened to spill. The familiar shame rose up, threatening to drown her. But before it could, a warm weight settled on her shoulder. Isaac's large hand, steady and gentle. She looked up to meet his dark eyes, finding nothing but respect there. In that moment, something shifted inside her. The gossip's words still hurt, but they didn't have the power to crush her spirit anymore. Not when this man, this warrior, who'd walked away from bloodshed to seek peace, looked at her with such quiet dignity. They shared a look of understanding, of mutual respect that needed no words. Helen straightened her shoulders and finished washing the plates, letting the spiteful whispers fade into nothing. But wind against the mission's walls, Reverend Harlan had witnessed the exchange, his lined face thoughtful as he arranged blankets for the night. The look he gave Isaac now held deep approval, recognizing the gentle spirit beneath the scout's imposing presence as darkness settled fully outside. The mission church became a sanctuary of warmth and acceptance. For the first time in her life, Helen felt the first tentative stirrings of hope. Perhaps she wasn't the burden everyone had always claimed. Perhaps, in this unlikely place with these unexpected companions, she had found the beginnings of something. New dawn light filtered through the mission's clouded windows, painting pale stripes across Helen's face as she stirred on the narrow church pew. Her makeshift bed of quilts had been surprisingly comfortable, though her muscles ached from yesterday's long ride. The familiar smell of coffee drifted from the Reverend's small kitchen, mingling with morning frost. The crunch of boots on frozen ground snapped her fully awake. Heavy footsteps approached the church door, followed by sharp knocking that echoed through the quiet sanctuary. Helen sat up, drawing her shawl close as Reverend Harlan emerged from the back room to answer. A well-dressed man stood in the doorway, his city boots gleaming despite the dusty road. His dark suit marked him as an outsider, someone who spent more time with papers than horses. Behind him, the sun cast his shadow long across the wooden floor. "Joseph Blackwood," he announced, tipping his hat with practiced smoothness. "Railroad surveyor. I have some matters to discuss." His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Helen before settling on Isaac, who had risen silently from his own pew. "Please, come in from the cold," Reverend Harlan offered, though his weathered face showed concern. Blackwood strode to the preacher's simple desk, spreading out several documents with flourish. "Just some formalities about the land southeast of town. The railroad's pushing through come spring." He spoke as if the matter was already settled. Isaac moved forward, his steps measured and calm. "That land belongs to my people under the Treaty of 1873. It is protected grazing ground." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Treaty or not, the rails will run. Progress doesn't stop for old papers." He shuffled through his documents, pointing to various signatures. "We've already secured rights from local landowners." Helen had drawn closer, curious despite her nervousness. Her heart stopped as she recognized the familiar scrawl at the bottom of one page, her father's signature. Samuel Barrett's name written in the same harsh strokes she'd seen on countless ledgers at home. The date showed he'd signed away grazing rights just 3 days ago. Her gasp drew Isaac's attention. Their eyes met, and Helen knew she couldn't hide this betrayal. Her father had sold out Isaac's people while arranging to be rid of her as well. Reverend Harlan leaned over the papers, his brow furrowed. "These agreements seem hasty. The treaty rights should take precedence. The territory is changing." Reverend Blackwood cut in smoothly. "Best not to stand in Progress's way." The threat in his voice was velvet-covered steel. Isaac stood straight and tall, his dignity a rebuke to Blackwood's smugness. "We will see what the Indian agent says about these papers." His voice stayed steady, but Helen saw his hands tighten on his walking staff. Blackwood gathered his documents with a shrug. "Suit yourself, but the rails are coming, Scout. Best make peace with that." He tipped his hat again and strode out, boots crunching away into the morning frost. The silence he left behind pressed heavy on Helen's heart. She knew she had to speak. "Isaac," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." Tay set out within the hour, leaving the mission's shelter behind. Helen rode Isaac's horse again, while he walked beside her as before. The wind bit cold across the open land, making her pull her shawl tighter. When they were well away from town, she found her courage. "That paper, the one with yesterday's date," she began, her voice shaking. "The signature was my father's. He sold those grazing rights while he was arranging to send me away." The words hurt coming out, but truth demanded speaking. Isaac walked several steps in silence, his face turned to the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice held no anger. "Thank you for telling me this truth. It cannot have been easy." Helen blinked back tears, amazed at his gentle response. "You're not angry?" "Anger solves nothing," Isaac said quietly. "Your father's choice is his burden to carry. You chose differently. You chose honesty." They traveled slowly through the day, the horse's hooves marking steady time across the winter-brown grass. Isaac walked tirelessly beside them, his stride never faltering. Helen marveled at his endurance, especially when he insisted she keep riding despite her offers to walk. As dusk approached, the air grew sharper with cold. Helen saw smoke rising ahead, thin gray lines against the darkening sky. Soon shapes emerged, conical lodges arranged in a sheltered valley. With horses grazing in a protected meadow, children spotted them first, running out with happy cries. To greet Isaac, they stopped shy of the horse, looking at Helen with frank curiosity rather than the judgment she was used to. Then women approached, their blanket-trapped forms moving with quiet grace. An elderly woman stepped forward, her silver hair gleaming in the last light. She spoke to Isaac in Apache, her voice warm. He responded with respect, gesturing to Helen. The woman smiled, reaching up to help Helen dismount. Before Helen could stumble on her stiff legs, someone draped a thick wool blanket around her shoulders. The weaving was beautiful, with patterns of earth and sky. "Welcome," the elderly woman said in careful English. "Come warm yourself by our fires." Helen clutched the blanket close, overwhelmed by this unexpected welcome. As Isaac led her toward the central fires, she felt something she hadn't known in years, the sense of being truly seen. Not for her size or her father's shame, but simply as herself. The smoke from the lodges curled up into the darkening sky, carrying with it the scent of cooking and the sound of children's laughter. Despite the weight of her father's betrayal, despite the uncertain future the railroad threatened, Helen felt an unfamiliar peace settle over her heart. Here, at least for this moment, she had found acceptance. The first light of dawn crept across the valley, painting the snow-dusted ground in soft pink and gold. Helen stirred beneath her warm blankets in the lodge, wakened by the sound of children's laughter floating on the crisp morning air. She sat up slowly, still marveling at how peaceful she felt here. So far from the harsh words of town. Outside, small footprints crisscrossed the fresh snow as children chased each other, their breath forming clouds in the cold. Their woolen blankets flapped behind them like wings as they darted between the lodges, playing some game Helen didn't understand but loved watching. Their joy was infectious, unmarred by judgment or cruelty. Cruelty. "You slept well." A woman's voice startled Helen from her thoughts. She turned to see a sturdy figure approaching, wrapped in a beautifully woven blanket. "I am Wei," the woman continued, her English clear and warm. "Come, help us with the morning work. The corn won't grind itself." Helen followed Wei to where several women sat with large stone matates, grinding dried corn into meal. Her heart quickened with anxiety. Would they mock her clumsiness, as the townswomen had? But Wei simply patted the ground beside her, showing Helen how to position the grinding stone. Like this, Wei demonstrated her movements smooth and practiced. Push forward with your weight, then back. The stone knows the way. Helen's first attempts were awkward, the stone slipping and corn kernels scattering. But instead of scorn, she heard gentle laughter and encouraging words in both Apache and English. Wei adjusted her grip, showing her how to use her body's natural strength. "There now?" Wei nodded approvingly. "You are built strong, like the earth. This is good for grinding." The simple praise brought unexpected tears to Helen's eyes. She blinked them away, focusing on the rhythm of the stone. Gradually, her movements became more natural, joining the steady pattern of the other women's work. The morning air filled with quiet conversation and the soft scraping of stone on stone. A small girl of perhaps 6 years settled nearby, watching Helen with curious eyes. Helen smiled at her, then began humming softly as she worked. The tune of Amazing Grace came naturally to her lips, a comfort from her childhood before shame had silenced her voice. The little girl's eyes brightened with recognition. "I know this song," she said in careful English. The mission lady taught it. Helen's smile widened. "Would you like to sing it together?" The child nodded eagerly, and soon her clear voice joined Helen's. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Other children gathered, drawn by the singing. Some knew the words, others hummed along, and soon the valley echoed. With their bright voices, even some of the women joined in, the hymn floating up with the morning mist. Helen's heart swelled with joy. Here was something she could share. A bridge between her world and theirs. As the day wore on, Helen found herself settling into the camp's rhythm. Her hands grew steadier with the grinding stone, and she learned to carry water from the stream without spilling. Every small success was met with quiet approval. So different from the mockery she'd known before. That evening, as darkness settled over the valley, The community gathered around the central fire. Helen sat slightly apart, still unsure of her place, until Wei beckoned her closer. The flames cast dancing shadows on faces that now seemed familiar rather than foreign. Isaac sat down beside her, offering her a cup of hot tea. His presence brought both comfort and a flutter of nervousness to her stomach. She watched his profile. In the firelight, strong and dignified, as he spoke with the elders about the day's hunting. When the conversation lulled, Isaac turned to her. "You worked well today," he said, his deep voice carrying genuine approval. "The women speak highly of your strength." Helen ducked her head, old habits of shame rising. "I was clumsy." "No." Isaac's word was gentle but firm. "You were learning. And you are built for endurance, not frailty. This is a blessing on the frontier, where life demands strength." His words struck deep into Helen's heart, unlocking something long buried. All her life, her size had been a source of mockery, her father's cruel words echoing in her ears. But here was Isaac, speaking of her body as something valuable, strong, rather than shameful. Tears pricked her eyes as she absorbed this new way of seeing herself. The peaceful moment shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. The camp stirred, women gathering children closer as a rider emerged from the darkness. Helen recognized him as one of the mission's helpers, his face grave in the firelight. "Isaac," he called, dismounting quickly. "I bring news from town." "Keishi!" His eyes flicked to Helen apologetically. "The talk has turned ugly. They're saying things." About Miss Barrett, Helen's stomach clenched. "What things?" The messenger shifted uncomfortably. "They're calling you, forgive me, a squaw wife, saying you've forgotten your proper place. There's talk of sending men to rescue you." The old shame tried to rise up and choke her, but before it could take hold, Asatz's hands settled warm and steady on her shoulder. "Let them talk," he said, his voice carrying the strength of mountains. "Their voices cannot break us if we stand together." Helen drew a shaky breath, clinging to his words like a lifeline. Around her, she felt the quiet support of the women, who had welcomed her, heard the echo of children's voices raised in song. The townspeople's cruel words still hurt, but they seemed smaller somehow, less powerful in the face of this newfound belonging. Still, as the fire burned lower and the camp settled for the night, Helen felt unease stirring in her heart. The world beyond this peaceful valley was gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. She held on to Isaac's words, wrapping them around her. Like a blanket against the coming cold, their voices cannot break us if we stand together. The morning brought more snow, falling in thick, silent flakes that blanketed the valley. Helen pulled her woolen shawl tighter as she made her way to the creek with 2 wooden buckets. The water still flowed beneath a thin sheet of ice, though the edges were starting to freeze solid. She watched carefully where she placed her feet, remembering Wei's warning about slick stones. Other women from the camp worked nearby, breaking ice and filling their own vessels. They nodded to her with easy familiarity now, no longer treating her as a stranger. "The winter comes early this year," one woman commented in English. Gesturing to the heavy sky, Helen nodded, studying the dark. "Clouds. Will there be enough food stored?" "We prepare," the woman assured her, though Helen noticed the concern in her eyes. But each winter brings its own trials. They worked steadily, the sound of breaking ice and sloshing water mixing with the soft hiss of falling snow. Helen's arms ached from carrying the full buckets, but she felt a quiet pride in her ability to help. Her father had always claimed she was useless, but here her strength served a purpose as she made her final trip back to camp. Isaac appeared beside her, taking one of the heavy buckets. "Walk with me," he said softly. "There is something I would show you." They climbed a narrow trail that wound up the ridge overlooking the valley. The snow had settled on Isaac's dark hair and broad shoulders, but he seemed unbothered by the cold. Helen's breath came harder with the climb, but Isaac matched his pace to hers without comment at the top. Isaac set down the water bucket and gestured across the valley spread below them. The snow had transformed the landscape into something magical, the familiar shapes of lodges and trees softened by white. But Isaac's attention was focused on the bottomlands that stretched along the creek. "There," he said, pointing to a relatively flat area where the valley widened. "That soil is rich. The spring floods bring new earth each year. A cabin there would stand against the winds with good grazing for cattle." His voice grew softer. "I have thought much about such a home." Helen's heart quickened as she looked where he indicated. In her mind's eye, she could see it, a sturdy cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. Lamplight glowing in windows, perhaps a garden plot cleared nearby, a place of safety and belonging. "The land remembers who tends it," Isaac continued. "My people have grazed horses here for generations. The treaties promise it will remain ours." But there was a note of worry in his voice that made Helen's chest tighten, as if summoned by those words. They heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider appeared through the falling snow, the railroad surveyor. Joseph Blackwood, his expensive coat dusted white. Isaac stepped slightly in front of Helen, his posture tense but controlled. "You are far from town, Mr. Blackwood." The surveyor's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's doing my job, checking the lay of the land." He pulled a folded document from his coat. "I have papers here, just need your mark releasing grazing rights. The railroad's offering fair compensation. The treaty already establishes our rights to this land." Isaac replied evenly. "Cannot sign them away." "Treaties change." Blackwood's smile grew colder. "Progress comes whether we want it or not. Better to profit from it than stand in its way." He paused meaningfully. "Shame if anything happened to delay that progress. Accidents can be costly." Helen felt a tremor of fear at the thinly veiled threat, but Isaac remained unmoved. "The law is clear," he said firmly. "This land belongs to my people." Blackwood's face hardened, but he tucked the papers away. "Have it your way." His thin smile returned. "But don't say you weren't warned." He wheeled his horse around, calling over his shoulder, "I'll be seeing you again soon." They watched him disappear into the swirling snow. Helen realized she was shaking, not from cold, but from the menace in the surveyor's words. Isaac's hand found her shoulder, steady and warm. "Come," he said gently. "Weah will have supper ready." The walk back to camp was silent, both lost in thought. Inside Waza's lodge, the fire had been built up against the growing cold. The smell of rabbit stew filled the small space with warmth and comfort. Weah handed them each a bowl without comment, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. Helen cupped the warm bowl in her hands, watching Isaac from beneath her lashes. The firelight played across his strong features as he ate, highlighting the worry. Lines around his eyes, her heart ached, knowing she had brought him additional troubles. The surveyor's threats felt like her fault. One more burden she had placed on this good man's shoulders. "Do you?" she began hesitantly, her voice trembling. "Slightly. Do you regret taking me? Everything seems harder now because of me." Isaac set down his bowl and turned to face her fully. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Helen," he said, his deep voice filled with quiet conviction, "I thank God for you." The simple words fell into the hush, of the lodge-like stones into still water. Helen felt them ripple through her, warming places long frozen by shame and rejection. Weah, busy by the fire, gave a small sound of approval. Helen ducked her head, overwhelmed by the emotion rising in her chest. But for the first time in years, she felt her lips curve in a real smile. Small and tremulous, but real. Here, in this simple lodge, with snow falling outside and danger gathering on the horizon, She dared to believe something she had thought impossible. She was wanted. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing upward. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but within the lodge, Helen felt the first blooming of something warm and precious hope. Taking root like spring flowers through winter snow, days melted into one another as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in deepening white. Helen noticed the worried glances between the women as they checked their food stores each morning. The dried meat and corn were holding steady, but winter had come early, and the supplies wouldn't last forever. Isaac found her one crisp morning as she helped stack firewood. "I have been thinking," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "We should build our own place near the river, a proper cabin where you might feel settled." Helen's heart quickened at the word "our." She nodded, unable to find words for the warmth that spread through her chest. They set out the next day with 2 strong horses and ropes for hauling. Isaac had chosen a spot where pine trees grew tall and straight, perfect for cabin logs. The old crosscut saw was heavy in Helen's hands as Isaac showed her how to work in rhythm, pull and push, pull and push. "Like this?" she asked, finding the steady motion. "Just so," Isaac smiled, his strong hands guiding the saw alongside hers. "You have a natural feel for it." The work was hard, but Helen discovered something surprising her body so often mocked. For its size, had strength that served her well. Her cheeks flushed with exertion as they worked, but she felt no shame in it. Each log they cut and stripped brought them closer to something that felt like a dream, a home of their own. They worked until dusk each day, setting up canvas near the building site. Helen learned to make coffee over the campfire, strong and hot, warming their hands as they rested. The cabin walls grew slowly but surely, log by log. Isaac showed her how to notch the corners so they fit together snugly, leaving no gaps for the wind to whistle through. One evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Isaac lit a brass lantern and carried it inside the half-built frame. The golden light spilled through the gaps between logs, making patterns on the snow. He gestured for Helen to join him. "See how the light fills it?" he said softly. "This place will be ours." His rough hand found hers, calloused from days of work but infinitely gentle in its touch. Helen felt tears prick her eyes at the simple beauty of it. Light and warmth against the darkness. The promise of shelter and belonging. The next morning, Isaac announced they needed supplies from town. Nails, salt, and a few other necessities. Helen's stomach tightened at the thought of returning, but she knew it was necessary. They rode in together, Helen on Isaac's spare horse, their breath making clouds in the cold morning air. Outside the mercantile, a group of young women, Helen had known since childhood, gathered, whispering behind their hands. Their words carried clearly in the winter air. "Look who's back," the Apache's woman, one sneered. "Didn't think she'd last this long in the wild? Probably eating them out of house and home," another added with a cruel laugh. Helen felt the familiar shame rising, but before it could take hold, Isaac's voice rang out, clear and dignified. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, offering his arm with courtly grace. "Shall we see to our shopping?" The simple gesture, the respect in his voice as he used her proper name, silenced the gossips more effectively than any angry words could have. Helen took his arm, holding her head high as they entered the store together. She felt the weight of stairs on her back, but for the first time, it didn't bow her shoulders. That evening, back at their campsite by the half-built cabin, Helen sat close to the fire, watching the flames dance. The day's hurts began to fade as she listened to the peaceful sounds of night settling over the valley, the soft nickering of horses, the distant call of an owl, the crack and pop of burning wood. Without thinking, she began to hum an old hymn her mother had loved about grace and redemption. The melody rose sweet and clear in the night air. Isaac sat beside her, his solid presence a comfort in the gathering dark. Slowly, carefully, as if afraid he might startle her, Helen leaned her. Head against his shoulder, he didn't stiffen or pull away. Instead, his arm came around her, strong and protective. They sat like that for a long while, watching the fire burn low, the hymn fading to peaceful silence. In that moment, Helen felt something she hadn't known in years, the sensation of being exactly where she belonged. The cabin stood half-finished behind them, its raw logs glowing in the firelight. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, but for now, this was enough. The warmth of the fire, the strength of Isaac's shoulder beneath her cheek, and the promise of home taking shape around them. The winter sun climbed higher each day. As Helen and Isaac worked to finish their cabin, Kaylin discovered a rhythm to frontier life that felt natural, despite her inexperience. Each morning, she rose early to help Isaac with the remaining construction, her hands growing surer with each task. Like this? Helen positioned the axe carefully, preparing to split kindling for their growing woodpile. The morning frost sparkled on the blade. Yes, Isaac nodded, standing close enough to guide, but far enough to show trust. Let the weight of the axe do the work. The kindling split with a satisfying crack. Helen smiled, pleasure warming her chest at this small victory. She was learning, growing stronger each day. Inside the cabin, Helen hung thick quilts along the walls, tucking them carefully between the logs for insulation. The bright patterns brought cheerful color to the rough-hewn interior. Some had come from Weah and the other women, gifts that spoke of acceptance. The simple space was becoming home, especially with the pot-bellied stove Isaac had hauled from town now warming the corner. Word spread through the Apache camp about Helen's cooking. Children began appearing at the cabin door around mealtimes, their dark eyes bright with hope. Helen found herself doubling her recipes, joy bubbling in her heart at their eager faces. Miss Helen, little Sarah called one morning, her breath visible in the crisp air. "Are you making bread today? Come see for yourself," Helen answered, lifting the heavy lid of her Dutch oven. The scent of fresh cornbread filled the cabin. Drawing appreciative sniffs from the small gathering of children, they crowded around as she cut generous squares. Steam rising in the cold air, their delight in such simple fare made Helen's eyes mist. Here, no one mocked her love of cooking or called her greedy. Instead, the children's mothers began sharing their own recipes, teaching Helen to work with unfamiliar ingredients. One evening, Isaac returned from hunting with something hidden behind his back. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he presented. Helen, with a wooden spoon carved from rich, dark wood. Delicate patterns traced the handle, speaking of hours of patient work. "For your cooking," he said simply. But his eyes held deeper meaning. Helen ran her fingers over the smooth surface, touched beyond words. No one had ever made her such a thoughtful gift. She clutched it to her chest, feeling truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. The days fell into a pleasant pattern. Helen cooked and cleaned, learning to keep house in frontier style. Isaac hunted and worked on finishing touches for the cabin, adding shelves and a small table. Their happiness grew quietly, like early spring flowers pushing through melting snow. Then came the telegram. Reverend Harlan arrived one afternoon. His usually steady face creased with worry. He dismounted slowly, as if carrying a heavy burden. "Isaac," he called. "Helen, we need to talk." They gathered inside the cabin, where the cooking fire cast warm light on troubled faces. The Reverend pulled a crumpled paper from his coat. "The railroad company," he began, his voice heavy. "They've hired men, armed men, to enforce their claim on the land." Helen's hand found Isaac's, gripping tight. The happiness they'd built felt suddenly fragile as spring ice. "How many?" Isaac asked calmly, though Helen felt tension in his shoulders. "A dozen, maybe more. They're due within the week." The Reverend sighed deeply. "I've tried reasoning with them, citing the treaties. But they waved papers signed by men who had no right to sell." Helen thought of her father's signature on those documents, shame and anger mixing in her chest. Isaac squeezed her hand gently, as if reading her thoughts. "We will not abandon what is rightfully ours," Isaac said firmly. "But neither will we. Seek violence, there may yet be a peaceful way." The Reverend nodded, though worry still lined his face. "I'll continue working through legal channels. And I'll pray. Sometimes that's all we can do." After he left, silence filled the cabin. Helen moved through the motions of preparing supper, her thoughts churning like storm clouds. The wooden spoon felt heavy in her hand as she stirred the stew. Isaac stood at the window, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. When he finally turned to her, his eyes were soft with something that made Helen's heart skip. "Come," he said quietly, gesturing to the bench by the fire. "Sit with me." Helen settled beside him, the firelight painting everything in warm gold. Isaac took both her hands in his touch gentle as always. "Helen," he began, his deep voice tender, "I need you to know something. You were not traded to me." Tears sprang to Helen's eyes at the memory of that bitter day in town. Isaac reached up to brush them away with his thumb. "You were entrusted to me by heaven itself," he continued. "A gift I never dreamed to receive." A sob caught in Helen's throat. All her life she'd been told she was worthless, a burden. But here was this man, this warrior with gentle hands, telling her she was heaven sent. Isaac's hand cradled her cheek, and Helen found herself leaning forward, drawn by something stronger than fear or doubt. Their lips met softly, sweetly, in the warm firelight. It was a kiss of promise, of acceptance, of love freely given and received. When they finally parted, Helen rested her forehead against Isaac's chest, feeling his strong heartbeat. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, this moment was perfect. The crackle of the fire, the lingering warmth of their first kiss, and the certainty that she was, at last, truly loved. The sky was still dark when Isaac jerked awake, his body tense. Helen stirred beside him on their makeshift bedroll near the cabin's hearth. Something had changed in the pre-dawn silence, a wrongness that made the hair on his neck rise. "Helen," he whispered, touching her shoulder. "Wake up. Something's coming." She blinked at him, confused, but years of frontier instinct had taught Isaac to trust his senses. The distant thunder of hoofbeats confirmed his fears. "Get the children to safety," he ordered, reaching for his coat. Several of the Apache children had taken to sleeping near their cabin, drawn by Helen's stories and warm cornbread. The first shots cracked through the darkness before Helen could respond. Horses screamed as riders burst into the clearing, firing wildly into the air. Their whoops and hollers scattered the livestock, sending cattle and horses fleeing into the woods. Helen recognized some of the men-hired guns from town, their faces half hidden by bandanas. "Get out, Indian," one shouted, brandishing a torch. "This ain't your land no more." Isaac stood tall in the doorway, his voice steady. "We have legal right to this land." The treaty, a bullet splintered the doorframe near his head. Helen gasped, pulling two small children behind her skirts. More riders circled the cabin, their torches leaving trails of light in the darkness. The first flame caught the corner of their home, licking up the logs they'd hauled together. Smoke began to curl into the cold sky, black against the stars. Helen screamed as another torch sailed through their window, setting the quilts ablaze. "No!" She lunged forward, but Isaac held her back. "Get the children to safety," he repeated. Firmly, then strode out to face the attackers. The fight was brutal and brief. Isaac managed to unseat one rider and disable another, but they had numbers on their side. A rifle butt caught him across the temple, sending him to his knees. Rough hands bound his wrists as Helen watched in horror. Through the chaos, a high-pitched cry pierced the air. Little Standing Bear, one of their frequent visitors, lay crumpled in the snow where a horse had struck him. Helen ran to him, gathering. His small body close, his leg was twisted wrongly, face pale with pain. The thunder of more hooves approached, but instead of help, 3 deputies rode up, their badges gleaming in the firelight. Helen's heart lifted for just a moment before, sinking as she saw their cold expressions. "We got reports of an Indian uprising," the lead deputy announced, ignoring the armed men who'd attacked them. "Isaac, you're under arrest for inciting violence." "That's a lie." Helen struggled to her feet, still cradling the injured child. "Please." "Men attacked us. Look what they've done to our home." The deputy's lip curled. "Shut your mouth, fat squaw wife. You're a disgrace to decent folk." Laughter rippled through the gathered men as 2 deputies roughly dragged Isaac to his feet. Blood trickled down his temple, but his eyes stayed locked on Helen's, full of concern for her rather than himself. "The boy needs help," Isaac said firmly, even as they clapped him in irons. "He's badly hurt." "Should have thought of that before you started trouble." One deputy sneered, yanking the chains. Helen watched helplessly as they forced Isaac onto a horse heading toward town. Their cabin, their dream of a home together, crackled and burned. Behind her, Little Standing Bear whimpered in her arms, his small hand clutching hers desperately, sinking to her knees in the snow. Helen held the child close and lifted her tear-streaked face to the lightning sky. "Please," she prayed aloud, her voice breaking. "Please help us. Give us strength. Don't let them destroy everything we've built." The hired guns were already riding away, their laughter carrying on the wind. Smoke continued to spiral upward as the first rays of dawn painted the snow pink. Helen clutched Standing Bear's small hand in hers, feeling his pulse flutter like a trapped bird. All around them, the scattered livestock bawled in confusion. And somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled a sound as lonely as her own heart. Members of the Apache band were emerging from their lodges now, moving cautiously toward the destruction. Weah hurried forward to help with Standing Bear, her face grim but determined. Together, they would face whatever came next. But for now, Helen could only pray through her tears. Watching the road where they'd taken Isaac away, Helen knelt beside Little Standing Bear's pallet in Weah's lodge, her heart aching as she changed the poultice on his injured leg. The boy whimpered softly, his small hand gripping hers as she worked. Outside, the winter wind carried the acrid smell of their burned cabin, a constant reminder of all they had lost. "You have gentle hands," Weah said softly, stirring the medicinal herbs brewing over her small fire. "The boy trusts you." Helen managed a weak smile, though grief and fear gnawed at her insides like hungry wolves. "Will his leg heal straight?" With time and care, Weah touched Helen's shoulder. "Thank you for staying with us. Many white women would have fled." "This is my home now," Helen whispered, though her voice trembled. "You're my family." Little Standing Bear drifted into uneasy sleep, and Helen tucked the blanket around him. Her thoughts turned to Isaac, alone in that cold jail cell. The image of him being dragged away in chains haunted her dreams as dawn broke the next morning. Helen wrapped her warmest shawl tight around her shoulders and mounted the horse Isaac had first given her. The animal seemed to sense her determination, standing steady as she settled into the saddle. "Be careful," Weah cautioned, pressing a small bundle of cornbread into Helen's hands. "The town is angry. Fear makes people cruel." The ride into town, felt longer than ever before. Helen's breath frosted in the cold air as her horse's hooves crunched through patches of snow. She rehearsed what she would say to the sheriff, praying for courage with each hoofbeat. The jailhouse squatted at the end of the main street, its windows dark and uninviting. Helen tied her horse to the hitching post, squared her shoulders, and climbed the wooden steps. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed open the heavy door. Sheriff Clayton lounged behind his desk, boots propped up, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. He barely glanced up as Helen entered. "Well, if it ain't the Indians woman." His lip curled in a sneer. "Come to visit your savage," Helen forced herself to stand straight, though her hands trembled. "I want to see Isaac. He's done nothing wrong." The sheriff's chair creaked as he leaned forward. "Nothing wrong. Causing trouble, threatening honest railroadmen. That's not true." Helen's voice rose. "They attacked us, burned our home, hurt an innocent child. Listen here, fat girl." Clayton stood, his face reddening. "Your daddy was right to get rid of you. Only an Indian would take such damaged goods. Now get out before I decide you're causing trouble too." Tears burned Helen's eyes, but she held them back. "Please, just let me see him. Get out." The sheriff's hand dropped to his gun belt. "And tell your Apache friends that if they try anything, this Indian scout won't live to see another sunset." Stumbling back into the street, Helen caught herself against a post. The winter sun seemed to mock her, bright and cold in a cloudless sky. From the saloon across the way, male voices carried clearly in the morning air. Railroad companies offering good money to make this land dispute go away. A man's throaty laugh drifted out. "Reckon that Indian scout might have an accident before." The trial. Ropes cheaper than lawyer fees. More laughter followed. Shame about his fat squaw. Though maybe we're doing him a favor, ending it quick. Helen's legs went weak. She hurried away from the voices, not stopping until she reached the mission church. The small building stood empty and quiet, sunlight streaming through its windows. Onto worn wooden pews, sinking to her knees at the altar rail, Helen buried her face in her hands. The hymn rose unbidden to her lips, trembling and soft at first, then gaining strength. "Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly, while the nearer waters roll, while the tempest still is high." Her voice broke on the last note, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. All the hurt and fear she'd held back came pouring out in great, racking sobs. "Hide me, O my Savior, hide, till the storm of life is past." The church door creaked, and Helen quickly wiped her eyes. Reverend Harlan's familiar steps echoed on the floorboards as he made his way down the aisle. "I thought I heard singing," he said gently, settling onto the pew beside her. "That was always your mother's favorite hymn." Helen nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The Reverend waited patiently, his weathered hands clasped in his lap. "They're going to kill him," she finally whispered. "The railroad men there, planning to," her voice caught. "I've heard the talk." Reverend Harlan's face was grave. "But remember, Helen, God often works in ways we don't expect. Sometimes he chooses what the world calls weak to shame those who think themselves strong." Helen looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. "What do you mean? Consider David against Goliath. Consider Gideon's small army. Consider how our Lord himself came not as a mighty king, but as a humble child." The Reverend's voice grew firm. "The world may mock you, Helen, but I see in you a strength they don't understand." His words seemed to kindle something in Helen's chest, a small flame of courage pushing back against the darkness of despair. She thought of Isaac's gentle strength, of Way's fierce loyalty, of little Standing Bear's trust. They needed her now, more than ever. "What should I do?" she asked softly. "Pray," Reverend Harlan answered, "then act on the wisdom God gives. You're not alone in this fight, Helen. There are those of us who still believe in justice." Helen closed her eyes, clutching the altar rail. The weak wood felt solid under her fingers, like a promise. When she opened them again, determination had replaced despair. "Thank you," she whispered, both to the Reverend and to heaven. The tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving behind a resolve as hard as frontier granite. Whatever came next, she would face it with the strength God gave her, fighting for the man who had first fought for her dignity. The morning sun cast long shadows across Samuel Barrett's ranch as Helen guided her horse through the familiar gate. Her heart thundered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady on the reins. The old homestead looked smaller now, its weathered boards and sagging porch a stark contrast to the memories of her childhood. Two strange horses stood hitched. Outside visitors her father must be entertaining. Helen tied her mount beside them, patting its neck for courage. The leather satchel at her hip held a change of clothes, but its true purpose was to carry something far more precious: the treaty. Papers Isaac had entrusted to her care before his arrest. "Just fetch what you need and go," she whispered to herself, climbing the creaking steps. Before she could reach for the door latch, voices drifted through the thin walls. Helen froze, recognizing her father's harsh laugh. "Ain't it something?" Samuel Barrett's voice boomed. "That useless daughter of mine finally brought me profit after all these years." Helen's hand dropped from the door. Through the window, she could see three men seated around the kitchen table, glasses of whiskey before them despite the early hour. Her father's face was flushed with drink and pride. "Two fine ponies for trading her off," Samuel continued. "And now the railroad's paying triple what that Apache land is worth. I reckon that's the first time that fat girl's weight worked in my favor." The other men chuckled, and Helen's cheeks burned. But the tears that once would have fallen remained locked away. Instead, cold clarity settled over her like frost. "Smart business," one man said, raising his glass. "Letting the railroad handle the Indian problem while you pocket the profits. And here we thought you'd lost your mind, trading your girl to a savage." Samuel knocked back his whiskey. The fat waist finally fetched a price. "And once they hang that scout for stirring up trouble, nobody'll care about old treaty papers or grazing rights." Helen backed away from the window, bile rising in her throat. The casual cruelty of her father's words hurt less than the calculated betrayal they revealed. He had planned this, all of it. Trading her hadn't been just spite. It had been part of his scheme to steal Isaac's land, moving silently around the side of the house. Helen slipped through the back door she'd used countless times as a child. The familiar creak of floorboards felt strange now, like walking through a place that belonged to someone else's life. Her old bedroom remained unchanged, the narrow bed, faded quilt, and small mirror where she'd endured years of self-hatred. Helen quickly gathered a few essential items into her satchel. But her true target lay in her father's study. The ranch's business papers were kept in an old cavalry chest beneath the window. Helen's fingers trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, leather folders bulged with documents, land deeds, cattle receipts, and beneath them all, papers bearing official government seals. Voices from the kitchen grew louder. The men were moving. Helen's heart nearly stopped as bootsteps approached down the hall. With trembling fingers, she extracted the treaties and agreements, recognizing Isaac's precise descriptions. These were the documents that proved his people's right to the disputed lands. The bootsteps grew closer. Helen shoved the papers into her satchel, just as Samuel Barrett filled the doorway. His face darkened with rage. "What in blazes are you doing here?" he snarled. Helen straightened, clutching her bag close. "Getting my things. Snooping, more like." Samuel's eyes narrowed as he spotted the open chest. "What did you take?" nothing that wasn't rightfully Isaac's. The words came out stronger than Helen expected. Her father lunged forward.
Us.
But years of dodging his anger had taught Helen well. She darted past him, her larger frame knocking him off balance as she fled down the hall. Stop her. Samuel's roar followed her through the house. Helen burst out the front door, nearly colliding with one of her father's drinking companions. She shoved past him, racing for her horse. Behind her, men shouted and boots pounded on wood. Her hands shook as she untied the reins, but muscle memory took over as she swung into the saddle. The horse, sensing her urgency, leaped forward just as Samuel emerged onto the porch with his rifle. "You steal from me, you're no daughter of mine," he bellowed. The words chased Helen down the road, but they held no power anymore. She was done being the shameful daughter, done believing his cruel judgments. The woman who rode away from Samuel. Barrett's ranch was someone knew someone, who had found her own worth. The winter moon rose pale and early as Helen urged her horse toward town. The precious papers rustled in her satchel with each stride, and hope rose in her chest like a hymn. Isaac had trusted her with these documents, believing in her strength when no one else did. Now she would use that strength to save him. Wind stung her cheeks as she rode, but Helen barely felt it. Her father's betrayal had burned away the last chains of doubt that bound her. She was no longer a burden to be traded or a weight to be mocked. She was a woman fighting for love, for justice, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was meant to be. The road stretched before her like a silver ribbon in the gathering dusk, leading her back to the place where her heart truly belonged. And this time, she rode not as someone's unwanted daughter, but as her own person, strong, determined, and finally, gloriously free. The first hints of dawn barely touched the eastern sky as Helen's horse thundered down the empty streets of town. Her breath came in clouds, the treaty papers clutched tight against her chest beneath her shawl. The parsonage sat dark and quiet behind the white-steepled church. But a faint glow flickered in one window. Reverend Harlan was already awake. Helen's knuckles struck the wooden door 3 times, urgent but controlled. Footsteps shuffled inside, and the door creaked open to reveal the Reverend in his morning robe, an oil lamp casting shadows across his concerned face. "Miss Barrett." He blinked at her disheveled appearance. "What brings you at this hour?" "The treaties," Helen gasped, still breathless from her ride. "I found them, my father's chest. Please, we must read them now." Understanding dawned in the Reverend's eyes. He ushered her inside, where the lamp's warmth barely touched the morning chill. His study smelled of leather-bound books and wood smoke from the dying hearth. "Here," Helen said, spreading the documents across his desk with trembling fingers. "The railroad's claim is false. Isaac's people have legal rights to those grazing lands." Reverend Harlan settled into his chair, adjusting his spectacles as he bent over the papers. Helen stood beside him, her heart pounding as he carefully turned each page. "These bear the territorial governor's seal," he murmured, tracing the elaborate signature with one finger. "And here the Apache chief's marks, witnessed by federal agents. The boundaries are clearly defined." Helen leaned closer as he began to read aloud. "Be it hereby established that the Apache peoples retain exclusive grazing and hunting rights to all lands west of Bitter Creek, extending north to the Russell Ridge line. These territories, too, remain undisturbed by settlement or development. The railroad's proposed route cuts straight through those lands," Helen said, her voice stronger now. They knew, they must have known these treaties existed. The Reverend nodded slowly, a deep furrow between his brows. Powerful men often choose to forget what's inconvenient to remember. He looked up at Helen, his expression grave but determined. "I will stand with you in this fight, Miss Barrett. But I must warn you, the town won't take kindly to having their plans disrupted. There will be resistance. I know." Helen straightened her spine, remembering Isaac's quiet strength. But truth must be spoken, whatever the cost. They spent the next hours reviewing every detail of the treaties, making careful notes. The Reverend's knowledge of territorial law proved invaluable as he explained the document's legal weight. By the time the morning sun streamed through the study windows, Helen felt armed with understanding. The courthouse clock struck 2 in the afternoon when Helen pushed open the heavy door of the sheriff's office. Her hands trembled, but she gripped the treaties firmly. Reverend Harlan's solid presence behind her lending courage. Sheriff Taylor lounged behind his desk, boots propped up, a piece of straw between his teeth. His eyebrows rose at their entrance, then narrowed when he recognized Helen. "Well, if it ain't the Apache's woman," he drawled. "Come to beg for your savage's release." Helen refused to flinch at the insult. "I've come to testify regarding treaty rights that prove Isaac's innocence." She stepped forward, laying the documents on his desk. "These papers bear the territorial governor's seal." The sheriff's boots hit the floor with a thud as he sat up. Despite his sneer, she saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as he noted. "The official markings, where'd you get these?" he demanded. "That's not relevant," Reverend Harlan interjected smoothly. "What matters is their legal standing. These treaties clearly establish Apache rights to the disputed lands. The railroad's claim is invalid." Sheriff Taylor's face darkened as he flipped through the pages. "This'll have to go before the town council. Can't just take the word of some." He paused, eyeing Helen with contempt. "Interested party." "Then call the council," Helen said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But Isaac remains imprisoned on false charges. These documents prove he was defending legal rights, not inciting violence. He stays where he is until this gets sorted." The sheriff's tone left no room for argument. "Could take days to verify these papers, maybe weeks." Helen's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice level. "Then I request to see him." After a long moment, the sheriff jerked his head toward the cells. 5 minutes, no more. The jail cells occupied the back of the building, iron bars casting strips of shadow across the wooden floor. Isaac sat on a narrow cot in the furthest cell, his tall frame making the space seem even smaller. He rose as Helen approached, moving to the bars with fluid grace despite his chains. Their eyes met through the iron grate, and Helen's breath caught at the quiet strength she saw there. No bitterness marred his features, only patient endurance. "I found the treaties," she whispered, pressing close to the bars. "They're making us wait for the council to review them, but they prove your rights to the land." Isaac's large hand reached through the bars to press against hers. The touch sent warmth spreading through her chest despite the cell's chill. "Hold on," Helen breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "I will not fail you." His fingers tightened briefly around hers. Though he remained silent, his eyes spoke volumes: trust, gratitude, and something deeper that made her heart flutter. The sheriff's boot heels scratched across the floor. "Time's up." Helen reluctantly stepped back, but kept her gaze locked with Isaac's. In that moment, she saw not a prisoner, but a man of dignity and honor. The town's prejudices could not diminish him, just as they no longer had power to diminish her. As she turned to leave, Helen's voice carried clearly through the jail. "The truth will be heard, Isaac. I swear it." The sheriff's derisive snort followed her out, but Helen walked tall beside Reverend Harlan into the afternoon sun. The treaties were secured, the first step taken. Though the path ahead would not be easy, she had found her courage at last. And she would need every ounce of it for the battle to come. Word raced through town faster than winter wind. By sunset, oil lamps blazed in every window of the white-painted church, their glows spilling across fresh snow. Townsfolk hurried through the deepening dark, boots crunching on frozen ground. breath clouding in the cold air as they whispered and speculated. Helen stood in the shadow of the church steps, her hands trembling as she clutched the treaty papers. Reverend Harlan touched her shoulder gently. "Remember," he said softly, "God gives strength to those who speak truth." Inside, the wooden pews creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the town. The air hung thick with wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove and the sharp scent of wool coats dampened by melting snow. Helen's heart hammered as she noticed the railroad men stationed at the back wall. Their arms crossed over expensive suits, faces hard in the lamplight. Her father, Samuel Barrett, lounged in a front pew, his customary sneer visible even in profile. The Reverend made his way to the pulpit, raising his hands for quiet. "Let us begin with prayer," he announced, his steady voice filling the sanctuary. "Lord, guide us to truth and justice this night." Helen barely heard the words over the rushing in her ears. When the congregation murmured amen, she knew her moment had come. Her legs felt weak as she rose, but she forced herself to walk steadily to the front. Treaty papers gripped tight in both hands. "Many of you know me," she began, her voice quavering. Someone snickered from the back pews. Helen swallowed hard and continued. "You know me as Samuel Barrett's burden of a daughter, the one he traded away for 2 ponies. More whispers rippled through the crowd. Helen's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin. "But that trade revealed God's mercy, because it led me to discover these." She held up the treaties, their official seals catching the lamplight. "These documents prove that the land the railroad claims, the land where Isaac's people graze, their herds was legally granted to the Apache by territorial governor's decree. That's nonsense." Samuel Barrett surged to his feet, face mottled red. "Those Indians have no rights here. The law says different, Father." Helen's voice grew stronger as anger steadied her nerves. "Your signature is on papers selling land. You had no right to sell. You knew about these treaties. You chose to ignore them for profit. Profit." Hostile murmurs swept the room. One of the railroad men stepped forward, his boots ringing on the wooden floor. "Now see here, no, you see here." Helen's voice rang out, surprising even herself with its force. She began to read from the treaties, clear and loud. These territories to remain undisturbed by settlement or development. In perpetuity, under protection of federal law, a woman's shrill voice cut through. "Why should we listen to her? She's just a fat squaw wife now." Laughter erupted from several pews. Helen felt the familiar shame rise up, threatening to choke her. But then she remembered Isaac's words. "You were built for endurance, not frailty." She straightened her spine. "Yes, look at me," she said, her voice thick with tears but unwavering. "Look at the woman you mock." But no, this sigh was not given away in shame. "I was given into God's care, though none of you could see it." The laughter died away. Helen wiped her cheeks with trembling fingers and continued, "I found love where you expected humiliation. I found strength where you predicted weakness. And now I stand before you with truth, though you'd rather believe comfortable lies." She turned slowly, meeting hostile stares and uncertain glances alike. "These treaties are real. The law is clear. And Isaac, the man you've imprisoned, was defending legal rights when he refused to give up his people's land. Prove it." Someone shouted, "How do we know those papers ain't forged?" "The territorial governor's seal can be verified." Reverend Harlan spoke up from behind Helen. "As can the witnesses' signatures. I've examined them myself." More murmurs filled the church, some angry, but others thoughtful. Helen saw faces she knew, the mercantile owner who'd known her since childhood, women who'd sat next to her in these same pews for years. Some wouldn't meet her eyes, but others nodded slowly. Then Samuel Barrett's voice cut through again. Cruel and mocking. Listen to my worthless daughter trying to sound important. Go back to your savage's tent where you belong." The words struck like physical blows, but Helen didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her voice in song, the hymn rising clear and true through her tears. "Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly. While the nearer waters roll, while the tempest still is high," the familiar melody filled the church. Helen's voice shook but didn't break as she sang the verse that had comforted her through so many dark nights. As the last note faded, silence fell complete and heavy. She looked out at the congregation. These people who had known her all her life yet never truly seen her until now. Some faces remained hard with prejudice, but others had softened. She saw uncertainty where there had been only scorn before. The silence stretched, broken only by the crack and pop of the wood stove. In that moment, Helen felt the full weight of truth settle over the room like a mantle. She had found her voice at last, and though the battle wasn't over, she knew she would never be silenced again. The church doors burst open, letting in a blast of winter air. The sheriff strode down the center aisle, his boots echoing on wooden floorboards. He held a sheaf of papers, his weathered face troubled as he approached the pulpit where Helen stood. "Miss Barrett," he said, clearing his throat, "I've had time to examine these treaty documents properly." He glanced around the packed church, then continued. "The territorial governor's office confirms their authenticity by telegraph. The Apache grazing rights are legally binding." A low murmur rippled through the congregation. The sheriff raised his voice. "Furthermore, we've received sworn statements from witnesses that the railroad men fired first, burning property and injuring a child. Isaac was defending legal territory." He paused, tugging at his collar. "As such, I'm ordering his immediate release." Helen's heart leaped. She pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Behind her, Reverend Harlan's hand squeezed her shoulder in quiet support. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Sheriff." The railroad men at the back of the church cursed and muttered, but the sheriff silenced them with a hard stare. "The laws. The law, gentlemen. Your claim is based on fraudulent sales. I suggest you take it up with your lawyers." Helen didn't wait to hear more. She gathered her skirts and hurried down the church steps into the bitter night air. Her boots crunched through fresh snow as she ran toward the jailhouse, breath coming in white puffs. A small crowd from the church followed, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. The jail door creaked open. Isaac emerged, ducking his tall frame under the low doorway. His face was weary but proud, his eyes seeking Helen through the darkness. She flew to him without hesitation. Isaac's strong arms wrapped around her, lifting her feet clear off the ground. He held her close, his face buried in her hair. Helen could feel his heart thundering against her chest, matching the wild beating of her own. "My brave one," he murmured, so only she could hear. "You fought for me. I had to," she whispered. "Back, I couldn't let them take you." From the edge of the crowd, Samuel Barrett watched with a twisted expression. When Helen's eyes met his, he turned away, shoulders hunched, unable to face the daughter he had wronged. He slunk toward the shadows of the saloon, leaving only footprints. In the fresh snow, the railroad men stomped past, their faces dark with anger. "This ain't over." One spat, but his threat rang hollow. Their legal claim lay in tatters, exposed by the very treaties they'd tried to ignore. Isaac set Helen gently back on her feet, but kept one arm around her shoulders. He surveyed the watching townspeople, their faces ghostly in the lantern light. Some looked away, embarrassed by their past cruelty. Others stared openly, perhaps seeing the couple clearly for the first time. Isaac's horse stood tethered nearby, steam rising from its flanks in the cold air. With deliberate grace, Isaac led Helen toward it. The crowd parted before them, creating a path through the snow. Instead of mounting himself, Isaac turned to Helen. His hands spanned her waist, strong and sure, as he lifted her into the saddle. The gesture was both tender and proud, a declaration, without words. But Isaac wasn't finished. He faced the gathered townsfolk, his voice carrying clear and strong through the still night air. "Look well upon this woman," he said. "She is not fat, as you have mocked. She is mine." His hand reached up to clasp Helen's, their fingers intertwining. "And I love her like no treasure on this earth." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Helen felt tears freeze on her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. The shame that had weighed her down for so long melted away like snow in sunshine. The watching people stood silent, stunned by the raw honesty of Isaac's words. No one dared to jeer or whisper. The mockery that had followed Helen all her life withered in the face of such open love and pride. Helen's heart soared as she gripped Isaac's hand. She sat tall in the saddle, no longer trying to make herself smaller, no longer wishing to disappear. The starlight caught the tears on her face, making them sparkle like diamonds. Isaac swung up behind her, his arms encircling her waist. Helen leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid strength of him, the rightness of being exactly where she was. Together, they rode through the hushed town, past the burned ruins of their first cabin, toward the Apache camp where children would greet them with joy and women would welcome Helen as sister. The night was cold, but Helen had never felt warmer. She was loved, she was home, and she was, at last, unashamed. The weeks that followed brought steady change to the valley. As winter's grip loosened, patches of earth emerged from beneath the snow. The sound of axes rang through crisp morning air as Isaac and Helen worked to rebuild their cabin near the meandering river. Help came from unexpected places. Apache women and children gathered stones for the hearth, while men from Isaac's band helped raise the sturdy log walls. Even a few settlers from town arrived with hammers and nails, their earlier prejudice softened by Helen's courage and Isaac's dignity. The snow melted gradually, feeding crystal streams that bubbled through the valley. Weah showed Helen how to choose the best spots for planting, where the earth would warm first. Together, they broke the soil, preparing a small garden plot beside the cabin's southern wall. "The seeds will grow strong here," Weah said, pressing Helen's hand. "Like you have grown strong." Isaac spent evenings carefully carving a wooden cross, his skilled hands shaping the cedar with reverence. When finished, he mounted it above their hearth, the firelight making the polished wood glow. Helen traced the smooth grain with her fingers, remembering the hymns that had sustained her through darker days as spring drew nearer. Children from both the Apache camp and town began visiting regularly. Their laughter echoed across the valley as they chased each other through melting drifts. Helen taught them songs while she worked, their clear voices joining hers in simple praise. One peaceful evening, Helen stood in their completed cabin, drinking in the sense of home. The windows gleamed with fresh glass, curtains stirred in the breeze, and savory aromas filled the air. She lit the lamp, its warm glow spreading across a wooden table where fresh cornbread cooled beside a pot of beans. Isaac entered, ducking his tall frame through the doorway. His eyes softened at the sight of Helen in their home. Without words, he took his place beside her at the table. Their hands joined naturally, heads bowing in quiet prayer of gratitude. Outside, winter stars scattered like diamonds across the darkening sky. The valley lay peaceful beneath their eternal watch. Through the cabin's window, lamplight spilled golden across the snow, a beacon of warmth and welcome in the gathering dusk. Helen's voice rose soft and clear in the stillness, singing the hymn that had carried her through her journey from shame to joy. "Jesus, lover of my soul." Isaac's deeper tones joined hers, their harmony floating out into the night, a testament to love's power to heal and unite across all boundaries. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.